You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday 3rd of October 2014. 5 jailed in Sheffield teenage sex abuse and trafficking case. 10 men held in Thames Valley exploitation probe. ISIS could become world's first truly terrorist state and bomb UK with nuclear and chemical weapons, Theresa May warns. Extremism Prevention Austria to amend century-old law on Islam to prohibit foreign funding. Hong Kong clashes as backlash builds against protests. Kurds seize Iraqi town from militants. Thought for the day, Nashona elder in the shite again. And finally, 2 for 1 Day Friday. Before I start the UK news, I do apologise for my voice, but I've got a little bit of an infection and so I probably don't sound quite myself. UK news. 5 jailed in Sheffield teenager sex abuse and trafficking case. 5 men have been given jail sentences totalling more than 28 years after a 13-year-old girl who ran away from home was trafficked for sex while she was missing for more than a week, police said. The teenager, who had only just had her 13th birthday, left her home in Sheffield in August last year and ended up in Bradford, where she came under the influence of a group of adult men, Sheffield Crown Court was told, during a 4-week trial that ended on Thursday. Police said the child suffered a horrendous ordeal at the hands of a group of adult men who transported and harboured an innocent young girl with the intention of committing sexual abuse. Shakil Rahman, 26, was jailed for 12 years after he was found guilty by the jury of raping the girl in a Bradford hotel and trafficking, South Yorkshire Police stated. Mohammed Shapal, 22, was jailed for 4 years and Yassine Amini, 37, was given a 5.5-year sentence after both were found guilty of sexual activity with a child and trafficking. Usman Ali, 21, was given 3 years in prison for sexual activity with a child, and Bekir Rashid, 37, was jailed for 4 years for trafficking. South Yorkshire police and officers used human trafficking legislation for the second time in a case of child sexual exploitation. World at 8, too little and too bloody late. Several generations of young girls have been ruined by these Muslim bastards. Prison sentences are rare and light compared to what is meted out by the media and the courts to old white men who have just had a grope eons ago. It simply is not fair at all. Ten men held in Thames Valley exploitation probe. Excuse the pun. A man has been arrested by police investigating alleged child sex exploitation. The 42-year-old was detained on suspicion of engaging in sexual activity with a girl aged between 13 and 15 by Thames Valley Police today. His arrest relates to offences allegedly committed in Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire between 2005 and 2008 and is part of Operation Articulate, a Thames Valley Police investigation relating to child sexual exploitation. A police spokesman said the man is currently in police custody. Last month, 2 men appeared at Milton Keynes Magistrates Court charged with alleged sex offences committed in Aylesbury between 2005 and 2008. Ha Mohan Nangpal, 40, of Langdale Drive, Hayes, Middlesex, is accused of raping a girl aged under 13, Thames Valley Police reported. A second man, Faisal Iqbal, 31, of Pixie Road, Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire, faces 1 count of conspiracy to rape a girl under 16. 8 other men, aged between 28 and 45, have also been charged in connection with alleged child sex exploitation, the spokesman reported. They face accusations of rape against teenage girls, forcing them into prostitution, ABH, which is actual bodily harm, and drugging them. They were arrested when 120 officers searched 11 properties in Buckinghamshire and Middlesex in synchronised dawn raids on September the 2nd. The men were named as Arshad Jaini, 32, from Aylesbury, Vikram Singh, 45, from Aylesbury, Asif Hussain, 32, from Milton Keynes, Jerome Joe, 35, from Buckingham, Sohail Kamar, 40, from Aylesbury, Akbiri Khan, 35, from Aylesbury, Taimur Khan, 28, from Aylesbury, and Sajid Ali, 34, from Chesham. They all appeared before a judge at Amersham Crown Court on Monday. World at 8. Nazir Afzal, please note the names of these pillars of the communities. ISIS could become world's first truly terrorist state and bomb UK with nuclear and chemical weapons, Theresa May warns. Home Secretary tells Tory conference we must act while we still have the chance, as she promised a clampdown on extremism in Britain. ISIS could acquire nuclear and biological weapons to launch attacks on Britain. The Home Secretary warned she set out new measures to clamp down on extremist groups. In a speech to the Tory party conference that concentrated almost entirely on the threat from terrorism at home and abroad, Theresa May warned that the jihadist group could become the world's first truly terrorist state in Iraq and Syria. If ISIS succeed in firmly consolidating their grip on the land they occupy in Syria and Iraq, we will see the world's first truly terrorist state established within a few hours of flying time of our country, she said. We will see terrorists given the space to plot attacks against us, train their men and women, and devise new methods to kill indiscriminately. We will see the risk, often prophesied but thank God yet not fulfilled, that with the capability of a state behind them, the terrorists will acquire chemical, biological or even nuclear weapons to attack us. We must not flinch, we must not shy away from our responsibility. We must not drift towards danger and insecurity. While we still have the chance, we must act to destroy them. In a bid to counter the threat of homegrown terrorism, Ms May said the next Tory manifesto would include a renewed commitment to the Communications Data Bill, the so-called Snoopers Charter. World at 8, I agree with her. Real steps must be taken to prevent a real 9/11 scenario over here. But of course we haven't helped, as we've allowed millions of Muslims in over a great many years and in fact are like turkeys, voting for Christmas. European news. Extremism prevention. Austria to amend century-old laws on Islam to prohibit foreign funding. Austria's new law on Islam will prohibit Muslim organisations receiving funding from abroad. This will also affect imams who work in Austria but are financially supported by Turkey. The amendment is designed to limit the power of influences from abroad, Foreign and Integration Minister Sebastian Kurz, OVP, said. He added that a one-off grant from abroad, such as money left in someone's will, could be allowed, but that the management of any such assets must be done within Austria. All living subsidies will be covered by the rule, including the money given to imams. Currently there are around 300 imams in Austria and 65 of them are employed by Turkey. The new law would mean they could no longer work in Austria. It would also compel Muslim organisations to teach at least one lesson in German, and states that officials within the community will be dismissed if they are found to have a criminal conviction or are considered to pose a threat to public safety. Under the terms of the draft bill, state-recognised religious organisations will have to offer a unified German language version of their doctrine and sources of faith, including for the Muslim holy book, the Koran. Kurz said the law contained a clear message, which is that there is no contradiction between being a devout Muslim and also being proud to be an Austrian. He said Sharia or Islamic law had no place here. World at 8, good man, not afraid of the nitpickers and lovers of Islam. Next step, stop halal killing, and many will go back from whence they came, which is another good step towards preserving their way of life in their own countries. World news. Hong Kong clashes as backlash builds against protests. Pro-democracy protesters clashed today with groups of people opposed to their campaign to shut down swathes of Hong Kong in an apparent backlash after days of anti-government demonstrations. Frustrations boiled over in two of the city's busiest shopping districts, where anti-protesters groups started to dismantle barricades that demonstrators have been manning in their battle for fully free elections in the Chinese-ruled territory, AFP reports. It was not immediately clear whether the anti-protester groups were disgruntled local business people tired of the disruption or, as some protesters alleged, hired hands brought in to stir up trouble. The tense scenes came after protesters earlier scuffled with police near government headquarters at the epicentre of the protest, and as China said, the demonstrators were doomed to fail. While the United States, Europe and Japan have all expressed their concerns at the scenes playing out in one of the world's leading financial capitals, China insisted there was no room to make concessions on important principles. Hong Kong's last British governor also weighed in, saying Beijing was foolish for not investing more trust in the city's 7 million people. Following a fifth night of rallies, crowds thinned out on Friday, leaving around 100 outside the government complex. Demonstrators had set a midnight Thursday ultimatum for Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying to resign and for Beijing to abandon proposals under which it will vet candidates who want to stand for the Chief Executive's job in the 2017 elections. Leung refused to quit, but in a dramatic televised appearance shortly before the midnight deadline, he appointed his deputy to sit down with a prominent students' group that had been at the vanguard of the protests. There was no sign of the talk started by this afternoon, however, and mistrust was rife that Leung was merely trying to buy time in the hope that the Hong Kong public will tire of the disruption caused by the mass sit-ins, with businesses losing money, schools shut and bus routes severed. World at 8. Nationalists now know that when organisations or governments turn to Marxism as opposed to fascism, there is a world of difference. Fascists are made to feel bad as they are not for the people, whereas the media bolsters up Marxists as being for the people, whereas in fact Marxists are not for the people at all, and many millions of deaths have proved this point. Marxists and communists have no conscience whatsoever. Kurds seize Iraqi town from militants. Rabia, Iraq. His plump body was splayed on a floor of the unfinished hospital building. His left arm was mostly blown off, a pool of blood staining the ground where his elbow would have been. His eyes were shut and the wall behind him was riddled with bullet holes. The nameless fighter was one of about 30 Islamic State militants who stayed during a 3-day battle with Kurdish soldiers for control of the strategic town on the Iraqi-Syrian border. Well armed with weapons that included American assault rifles, they took shelter in the hospital in the centre of town. The Kurds gained control of the hospital Thursday, aided by a British airstrike Wednesday. Captain Nakib Hami said the Turkish fighters began the successful assault on the building nearly 5 hours after an airstrike by the US-led coalition, trying to halt the militants' advance across much of Syria and Iraq. Inside the building they found a handful of bodies and expected to find others under mounds of rubble caused by artillery fire and bombings. As many as 20 militants fled the building, escaping the siege by hundreds of Turkish soldiers. "We have no idea how they escaped," Major Tayyib Abdul Rahman said. He ventured a variety of guesses, such as secret underground tunnels in the hospital basement. As darkness approached, the fighters began to file out of Rabia, abandoned but for a minimal security presence around the town limits. Inside the hospital the corpses of the militants remained, and it was unclear whether the Kurds would remove them. As for the fighters who escaped, "If we see them," Major Abdul Rahman said, "we will kill them." World at 8. They should exhibit these bodies for the media who have been backing these bastards for the last couple of years. Note the underground tunnels in the hospital basement. And don't show me pictures of dead Syrian or Palestinian children anymore. Thought for the day: Nashona elder in the shite again. Now, continuing the Nashona annals of Off the Res, this week many years ago saw a change in the way the Wendigo operated. Now you know, and I know, that this story will not have a happy ending for the Wendigo, but may have a good ending for many of the clans on the Res. It came to pass that the tribal elder Legrief, who had been banished with his family off the Res and into the wilderness beyond, had been given a title on his banishment from the Wendigo to soften the acts that had been perpetrated upon him. This title was "May Hell Freeze Over," and he was unhappy to be the recipient of such a title. Now, many of the tribal stories that make up the actions and formation of the Wendigo are various and many. One of which is that in days gone by, the original clan of the Nashonas was from the nation of the Nashona people called the Nashona Front. This was led by an old chieftain called John of the Tins, and he was a popular chief. Now it came to pass that a young warrior called Legrief entered this chief's tepee, and his counsel was heard. In the years after, that young warrior and John of the Tins aligned, but not all was good in that tepee. Suffice to say, when the Nashona Front became the nation of the Nashonas from the clan of the Fakawis, many of the old guard were not happy, and although they joined Legrief in much celebrating, they never forgot John of the Tins and carried this grudge in their hearts for many, many years, waiting for a chance to banish Legrief and his family. As we know, this time came to pass, and old scores were settled, and it is not for me to say whether they were deserved or not, but time doesn't heal, and time doesn't forget the old ways, and we all need to be mindful that whoever gets you out of the shit is not necessarily your friend, and who puts you in the shit is not necessarily your enemy. Now to newer times and the new title Le Griffe had been presented with. This ex-chief was not happy with it, as indeed were many of his companions and allies. It denoted a form of sarcasm and evil, and it was complete in that title. And in truth, that title denoted the full hate of the Wendigo upon Le Griffe. How could Le Griffe fight such a title? The Eurogitch's gold had gone, and dancing with sticks, despite his many death dances with Dawn of the Dead, had failed to kill more tribal elders for their gold, and indeed had taken to sitting outside their tepees, not allowing them to eat, so they would die quicker in his haste to acquire more gold. In many cases it was said that his squaw, Dawn of the Dead, would light fires outside their tepees and waft smoke signals inside, so that they would understand her message. In time, members of the old Nashona front came to the fore of the tribal meetings, and were great in their evil doing. They crawled out of the woodwork, put in place squaws who would talk with a forked tongue, and created evil in the heart of the Nashonas. They had not forgotten the old times, and were hell-bent in recreating them again over the ashes of the new Nashonas and its people on the res. At this time Le Griffe was suffering and attempting to help his old friends who were now his enemies, to keep what gold was in the tribal coffers before the Great One who receives could come calling, but he was speaking to the walls and the wind, and no one listened because no one cared. He built many fires and wafted many messages to the winds, which came before and over the tepees of the Wendigo in its entirety, and still they did not heed. Le Griffe, who was of course no saint, as no Nashonas ever are, grew angry that his messages did not fall on hearing ears or were seen by seeing eyes, and his words were twisted and unheard in the tepees of the Wendigo and its followers. Despite his banishment, Le Griffe still wanted to help the followers, and was riding around on his horse and meeting many other tribes and spreading the word of the Nashonas. It came to pass that on such a night the Wendigo issued its final curse. It sent a deerskin missive by a slow runner to the tepee of Le Griffe, which was many miles away from the res, and its tribal council, but so as to tell the Nashonas before the deerskin arrived, before the eyes of Le Griffe. They built huge fires on the many mountains beyond, and lit the fires of the Wendigo, and told all that could see that Le Griffe did not have his title any more, and his banishment from the Nashonas as a tribe had been made perfect. He was no longer Le Griffe of the Nashonas from the clan of the Fakawis and the nation of the Nashona front. He was alone. When he was told of this from many of his followers who had spied the smoke signals, Le Griffe was surprisingly calm. He was relieved that the Wendigo had done the job of the Nashona front of old, and that it was over. All his smoke signals could cease. He could stop worrying over the Great One who receives, and what would happen would simply happen. Le Griffe would not have to inscribe stones over and over again in his wish to help what he once viewed as fellow warriors. He could rest, and he was happy in his rest. He could pursue the path he wanted, with whom he wanted, and was free of the ties of the Wendigo. But his thoughts remained with the faithful of the Nashonas, and what their plight would be now left to the whims and vagaries of the Wendigo. There was much smoke over the Nashona homelands and outside the tepees of the faithful, many of whom had never heard of the Nashona front, and the years it had waited to emerge yet again in its revenge for John of the Tins. And it must be said that although the Nashona front tribe had been fairly successful in its war parties, it had never reached the peaks of popularity even outside the res that the Nashonas out of the Fakawis had attained in previous years, before the onset of the Eurogitchis, when tribal councillors came to the fore who should never have come to the fore, and background warriors operated great evil upon the Nashonas under differing titles. So now we have a free Lagriff and a tribe under the Wendigo hooves who revelled into the night with firewater whilst taking away a title that Lagriff hated anyway and meant absolutely nothing. Many Wendigo followers attended a tribal council in the north of the res and heard Walking with Sticks utter he would answer any questions various tribal members had to ask on this night of the burning of the deerskins. A faithful warrior wrote the scene down on his deerskin and smuggled it out for posterity. The whole debacle resembled a much-loved Keystone Cop scenario many, many years later. I quote, "This northern tribal council was not halted. Walking with Sticks did not make an appearance, but Fiddling with IT did, but vanished some time later. During this time it was said that Dancing with Strings had been seen in another watering hole, and all the warriors got on their horses and rode to this watering hole. They entered this teepee and it was empty, and then some warriors saw Walking with Sticks hovering nearby, and they entered this portion of the teepee, and the Nashona warriors entered this area. Dancing with Sticks ran out of the opening flap and into the night. These warriors approached Walking with Sticks, who due to his name couldn't run, and talked without forked tongue to him. Walking with Sticks finally uttered something near the truth and said that it was all out of control and they needed to speak with Lagriff. But of course they had removed Lagriff that night, along with his title, to the outskirts of the Nashona tribal lands and therefore couldn't speak with forked tongues in his presence anymore. This was the end of the Northern Tribal Council meeting. This was the Wendigo and its answer to the warriors of the Nashonas. Despite the flurry of smoke signals and the proclaiming that more and more warriors were joining the Nashonas under the Wendigo now that Lagriff had gone, these fell like stones on the hearts of the Nashona people. And they saw it for what it was, lies spoken with many forked tongues. What is the future of the Nashona people? How can they rid themselves of the Wendigo and its evil? Will the Great One who receives end the Wendigo and its plans for the future? How can Dancing with Strings, who was not elected by the warriors, run a proper tribal council also not elected? If there are no tribal councils or tribal elections made in the deerskins and on the wind, how can this tribe survive without the voice of the warriors and the people who live under its laws? True, the Nashona cause is greater than the tribe, but it needs a tribe to exist in the first place, or else it will become so much smoke in the wind. And finally, 2 for 1 Day Friday. Subject: as I age. When I was ready to check out and pay for my groceries, the cashier said, "Strip down facing me." Making a mental note so I could complain to my local MP about this security rubbish, I did just as she had instructed. After the shrieking and hysterical remarks finally subsided, I found out that she was referring to how I should position my credit card. Nonetheless, I've been asked to shop elsewhere in the future. They need to make their instructions a little clearer for seniors. Man, I hate this getting older stuff. And some thoughts on booze. Without question, the greatest invention in the history of mankind is beer. Oh, I grant you that the wheel was also a fine invention, but the wheel does not go nearly as well with a pizza. Warning: the consumption of alcohol may cause you to tell your friends over and over again that you love them. To some it's a six-pack, to me it's a support group. Salvation in a can. Dave Howell. Warning: the consumption of alcohol may make you think that you can logically converse with members of the opposite sex without spitting. And saving the best for last. As explained by Cliff Calvin of Cheers, one afternoon at Cheers, Cliff Calvin was explaining the buffalo theory to his buddy Norm. Here's how it went. Well, you see, Norm, it's like this. A herd of buffalo can only move as fast as the slowest buffalo, and when the herd is hunted, it is the slowest and weakest ones at the back that are killed first. This natural selection is good for the herd as a whole because the general speed and health of the whole group keeps improving by the regular killing of the weakest members. In much the same way, the human brain can only operate as fast as the slowest brain cells. Excessive intake of alcohol, as we know, kills brain cells, but naturally it attacks the slowest and weakest brain cells first. In this way, regular consumption of beer eliminates the weaker brain cells, making the brain a faster and more efficient machine. That is why you always feel smarter after a few beers. Warning: The consumption of alcohol may well think you are whispering when you are not. You've been listening to The World at 8. Remember, we are now on Mondays and Fridays. I am Lynn Mozart, and I and the team at World at 8 and Radio Britain wish you all a very happy and a very safe weekend. For 12 years after he was found guilty by the jury of raping the girl in a Bradford hotel and trafficking, South Yorkshire Police stated. Mohammed Chappell, 22, was jailed for 4 years, and Yassine Amini, 37, was given a 5.5-year sentence after both were found guilty of sexual activity with a child and trafficking. Usman Ali, 21, was given 3 years in prison for sexual activity with a child, and Bekir Rashid, 37, was jailed for 4 years for trafficking. South Yorkshire police and officers used human trafficking legislation for the second time in a case of child sexual exploitation. World at 8, too little and too bloody late. Several generations of young girls have been ruined by these Muslim bastards. Prison sentences are rare and light compared to what is meted out by the media and the courts to old white men who have just had a grope eons ago. It simply is not fair at all. Ten men held in Thames Valley exploitation probe. Excuse the pun. A man has been arrested by police investigating alleged child sex exploitation. The 42-year-old was detained on suspicion of engaging in sexual activity with a girl aged between 13 and 15 by Thames Valley Police today. His arrest relates to offences allegedly committed in Aylesbury case. 5 men have been given jail sentences totalling more than 28 years after a 13-year-old girl who ran away from home was trafficked for sex while she was missing for more than a week, police said. The teenager, who had only just had her 13th birthday, left her home in Sheffield in August last year and ended up in Bradford, where she came under the influence of a group of adult men, Sheffield Crown Court was told, during a 4-week trial that ended on Thursday. Police said the child suffered a horrendous ordeal at the hands of a group of adult men who transported and harboured an innocent young girl with the intention of committing sexual abuse. Shakil Rahman, 26, was jailed.
You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday 3rd of October 2014. 5 jailed in Sheffield teenage sex abuse and trafficking case. 10 men held in Thames Valley exploitation probe. ISIS could become world's first truly terrorist state and bomb UK with nuclear and chemical weapons, Theresa May warns. Extremism prevention Austria to amend century-old law on Islam to prohibit foreign funding. Hong Kong clashes as backlash builds against protests. Kurds seize Iraqi town from militants. Thought for the day, Nashona elder in the shite again. And finally, 2 for 1 Day Friday. Before I start the UK news, I do apologise for my voice, but I've got a little bit of an infection and so I probably don't sound quite myself. UK news. 5 jailed in Sheffield teenager sex abuse and trafficking.